Curator of the Van Avery Smith Galleries at Davidson College. Thanks for joining us for our talk today with Anthony Goicolea and Shoshanna Weinberger. So for the galleries, the COVID-19 pandemic, like most folks, really upended things, pivoted our whole exhibition and programming this year based on that. And we were able to open a new exhibition that was really drawn from the current moment, inspired by the current moment, both one of social isolation, thinking about the pandemic, and then also as we moved into late May and June, thinking about the murder of George Floyd and protests and sort of the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. So our exhibition that's on view right now opened in late August, and it features about 30-something works from artists, and it's fully drawn from our collection. And so Anthony and Shoshanna are two of the artists in the exhibition. And so we're really excited to kind of dig in to both of you, talk about works that are a little bit older, maybe for you, but thinking about these works in our collection, what it means in the moment, and then kind of moving along and learning more about what you've been doing since then. So Anthony, we actually met, I think it was 7 years ago that your exhibition was here at Davidson. It was one of the first exhibitions that I curated here. I had only been here a few months, and we very quickly pulled together an amazing exhibition of works that really spanned media and spanned about a decade of your career. And one of the pieces in that exhibition was a work called Deconstruction, which we more recently were able to acquire. So that is in our current exhibition, and we'll talk a little bit more about that soon. And then Shoshanna, your work was in a more recent exhibition in 2016 called Material Matters, where we really dug into, we were thinking about an exhibition that we had curated here at Davidson about 40 years ago around drawing and printmaking. And we were thinking about, like, what does that update look like? What are artists doing now? Thinking more about drawing and painting media. And so it was a group show with, I think, 8 artists. And Elizabeth actually was part of that curatorial team. Say hello, Elizabeth. Elizabeth is our gallery and collection coordinator, and we curated that with a faculty member here, Tyler Starr. And we're able to acquire that work right after that exhibition. So I was thinking today our format could be, I'll do a little more formal introduction of both of you, and then we'll turn it over to each of you to talk a little bit about your work, sort of the series of works that, that these works belong to, the works in our collection, update us kind of more on what you're doing now. I have some questions, and we'll be able to turn it over to questions through the YouTube Live. So if you are tuning in and you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and Elizabeth will help us moderate those questions. The YouTube Live has a little bit of a delay, so we will try to get your questions in early, but we'll try to hang on and see what might come up. So Anthony Goicolea holds a BA in art history and a BFA in drawing and painting from the University of Georgia, Athens, and an MFA in sculpture and photography from Pratt Institute of Art in New York. His work has been shown in numerous exhibitions, including at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, DC, Museo Reina Sofia in Madrid, among many other institutions. His honors include a BMW Photo Paris Award, a Joan Mitchell Foundation grant, and a Cintas Fellowship. His work can be found in major public collections, including the Hirshhorn, the Whitney Museum of American Art, Museum of Modern Art in New York, and the Brooklyn Museum. And he recently created the New York City LGBTQ Memorial, and he currently lives in Brooklyn. Thanks. Joining us from your studio. And Shoshanna Weinberger earned her BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and her MFA from Yale University. She has exhibited in solo and group shows in the United States and Jamaica at venues including the National Gallery of Jamaica in Kingston, Solo Project House in Newark, Woman Made Gallery in Chicago, among many others. Her awards and fellowships include a Joan Mitchell Foundation Painters and Sculptors Grant, a New Jersey State Council on the Arts Fellowship, and the Dawn Scott Memorial Award from the National Gallery of Jamaica. She is in her second year as the Macmillan Stewart Endowed Chair in Painting. Second at MICA at the Maryland Institute College of Art. And she currently resides and is joining us from her studio in Newark, New Jersey. So thank you both for being here and sharing about your work. I pulled both of you together. I know you don't know each other, although you're nearby, you should know each other. But I pulled your work together, even though I think we'll see soon that there's lots of differences, particularly thinking about media and just the visual languages that you're using. I felt like there were some interesting overlaps. One, you both work pretty fluidly through different media. So Shoshanna using painting, gouache, collage, but you've also have worked sculpturally, working more in three-dimensional work. Anthony, same. Your show here alone and your degrees kind of show your interest in painting, photography, video. You now have done this public artwork, lots of sculptural pieces. So that sort of commonality is thinking about how you communicate different ideas, conceptual ideas through these different media. And then at the risk of like falling into a trap around too much identity or like reading too much into your biographies, I think there is an overlap in terms of like this exploration of self, thinking about marginalized or criminalized bodies, how you think about the way other people see and read your body in the landscape. The works feel to me very much about reclaiming or reframing sort of the way that people see your bodies and about empowerment ultimately. Anthony, you in many of the earlier works used your own body repeatedly, your own likeness. Shoshanna, your works, though more abstracted, come directly from your body. I'm thinking about the work in our collection, which the title is related to your body measurements. And then there's like this wildness to both of your works, this sort of like animalistic, wildness is the way that I can describe it. I think the works overlap around ideals of beauty, masculinity, femininity. I'm thinking even about makeup and fashion. And then it's hard for me not to think about your relationship to other places and cultures. So Anthony, as the children of Cuban immigrants, and Shoshanna having been born in Jamaica, but raised in the US, it's hard not to see that sort of shifting identity in both of your works. So that was why I thought it might be interesting to pull you together, and particularly in this precarious, strange moment that we're living in. So I thought maybe we could start, we're going alphabetical, we decided. So Anthony, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. So let me see if I can technically do this. So you're seeing my screen now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's see. Okay, so yeah, just quickly, let me grab, just wanted to grab a timer just so I'm not completely off track. I just put together a couple of slides that kind of go through my body of work. These are some earlier representations, as Leah was mentioning, of photographs of mine in which I portrayed more than one character in a single photo. A lot of them dealing with coming of age issues in adolescence and that sort of transitional period between boyhood and manhood. I shot a lot of these photographs on set with natural light and would pre-choreograph the positions that I was in, and then did intensive labor and post-production afterwards with Photoshop. And these were done between the period of like 1998 to about 2001. And this is one of the last photos in that series in which I realized that I was becoming more interested in the landscape and the interventions that I was making within the landscape. And so I sort of turned my eye more towards that, and I extracted myself as the subject and began working with other people, although a bit marginally, in a sense that I was focusing more on the landscape as the main character, and the figures within it were more these kind of subordinate roles. So they're often masked or hooded or dressed alike in a way that they operate as a band of outsiders and this homogenous unit. And again, I was constructing a lot of these sets and these interventions within this kind of lush environmental setting. But then as a almost knee-jerk reaction to that, I became interested in these more urban environments that are more brutalist and began photographing predominantly in black and white. This is the image Deconstruction that's in the show at Davidson now. You can see this is a close-up detail. I was also working, again, with figures, but marginalized within the environment. And these were now elderly people. So in this image, there are a series of people about ages 70 and up sleeping in hammocks in this burnt out building. And it's funny, I was putting together this presentation and I kind of realized that a lot of these images that at the time I was making, I felt like they seemed really desolate and somewhat apocalyptic and otherworldly. I now look at them and I'm like, oh, this looks like a photo from the New York Times article this morning. So this kind of reminds me a lot of the fires out west. This morning there was an article about 270 beached whales in Tasmania. So the world has somehow managed to make my kind of surreal, otherworldly photographs seem normal, which is a bit sad. But and then I continue to work with the landscape and creating these temporary structures within them. I was working on a series of monuments in a way, or temporary monuments, constructing elements within the landscape and then repositioning them and reworking them in post-production, dealing with ideas of migration and transition and housing and that sort of thing. At the same time, I continue my painting practice, which also explores the idea of landscape, but I kind of view it more as landscape as portrait. So you'll notice here these kind of birch trees amidst this feral cotton field. They merge different elements from my background. So for instance, this is called Spanish moss, and it's Spanish moss that you would see in Florida and in Cuba, but transported to a more New England environment where I live now. So these landscapes also are large scale. They're about 8 to 10 feet large in each direction. And they're painted on frosted mylar film on both sides and then mounted to board. And they also have this kind of bleak, dark kind of impression in which they're being depicted in the transitional time between dawn and dusk where the light is shifting. The painting practice also melds a bit into my installation and sculptural work. This is a piece called Portrait of a Video Still. And you can see that it's a landscape painting done directly on top of a video screen. And the painting is of a makeshift video screen with subtitles painted in directly on the bottom. They're the last couple of lines from the movie The Misfits, which was a screenplay by Arthur Miller, and the landscape plays a predominant role. And so this idea of trying to convert landscape and these two-dimensional paintings into these three-dimensional environments persists within my work. Here you can see the rear view of this Japanese rock garden created out of paintings of trees held up by scaffolding. And so the scaffolding in the painting is mimicked by the stage scaffolding behind the work itself. And that kind of scaffolding and armature also is prevalent in other works like this piece entitled Chorus, in which I present portraits of 16 people. And the portrait is not based so much on their facial features as much as their gestures and characteristics. They're presented on chrome music stands at roughly human height, and they're assembled in this staggered view on a seamless backdrop that's traditional in a portrait studio to create a chorus. And this is another sculptural installation involving plaster cast pillows or sandbags with painting that's rear mounted on thick acrylic resin slabs. And this took place in Germany in an old refugee center for a show called Between the Worlds, which dealt with the idea of adolescents in the migration system and refugee system. And so this notion that they're sort of figuratively and literally between two worlds, where they're in between the idea of childhood and adulthood, but also between two physical states. These are other sculptures that kind of incorporate this transition of two-dimensional media into these 3D forms using these plaster cast pillows, cement, and drawings and photos cast into these acrylic resin slabs. Here you can see mugshots of people that I culled from archives. There are people who were arrested between the period of like 1930 to the late 60s for being sexual deviants, which is basically code for being gay or lesbian, trans people in the community. And so I've taken their mugshots and reworked them so that they appear as these grainy nighttime vision photos. And they're difficult to see unless you look through the side of the refracted image in this resin slab, because they're obscured by this granite stone, which acts almost as a marker. So these are called Untitled Markers, and they're almost like headstones in a way for these people that had to live in the shadows, unfortunately. This clearly dovetails into the project that I did in New York City. This is the New York City LGBT Memorial. It's located in the Hudson River Park in Greenwich Village. And it's a configuration of 7 large stones in a circular formation. And the stones are actually made from bronze, and they're bisected, split in half, and rejoined by this prismatic glass that at different times of the day, the sun will hit off a certain angle and cast these different rainbow patterns, or breaks the light into this color spectrum that references the idea of the LGBT flag. And the most central stone is bisected. It does not have any glass reuniting it. Instead, it bears this internally facing inscription from Audre Lorde. And at night, you can see it illuminated against the backdrop of the city. And then finally, I wanted to include a few more recent pieces. This is a large-scale oil painting on Mylar. It's called Caravan, and again, deals with the idea of migration and transition. I think Leah mentioned earlier that my entire family is Cuban. I'm first-generation American, and so a lot of those stories kind of were built into my family narrative, this idea of being able to or having to flee your homeland, and this notion that nothing is permanent. This is balseros, which roughly translates into boat people. Again, another image. This is oil on raw Belgian linen, and it's a piece called Inflatable Pietà. This is Blind. This is a large-scale piece. It's about 8 feet by 12. It's called Vigil, and a lot of my work is a visceral response to what's going on around me. So this was done in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing. Particularly, there were many vigils going on here in New York. And so this was a response to that, as well as this piece was a response directly to the COVID pandemic. I was asked by the Pushkin Museum in Moscow to create a piece, and so I chose to do a silent film in which the piece is narrated by a drawing a day done in quarantine and sort of overseen by this MC reminiscent of kind of fin de siècle MCs and portrait paintings from the last large pandemic during the Spanish flu. This is Black Island Tower, more photos that I'm working with that deal with this idea of immigration and migration and transition. And then finally, the last image, this is Encampment, which again, ended up being somewhat prescient. I photographed these tents almost a year ago and had kept them in my photo library and hadn't had a chance to work on them. And then during the pandemic was working on them, and they began creating these outdoor hospital units that looked very similar to this. So once again, kind of tried to create this otherworldly, dreamlike environment that ends up, unfortunately, becoming a reality. So, but yeah, that's basically an overview of what I've been working on. And yeah, I'm happy to turn it back over to you, Leah.
Muted, I'm muted. I think we'll have, some questions once Shoshanna presents as well, because I think there's some interesting overlap. But in viewing the body of work that you shared, I'm just interested in how I feel like that in the past, the works, the two-dimensional and three-dimensional works they definitely existed together, and structures were made for photographic works, but they seem like they're merging even more, that there's like both like conceptually and technically process-wise, there's like, they're seamless in terms of the two-dimensional and three-dimensional practices. I don't know if that's if that is true the way that you view it, but it seems like they've come together in a much tighter way.
Yeah, I think I used to try to create exhibitions in which I was using photography and painting and sculpture and as discrete works that they spoke to each other, but they were their own thing. And I sort of thought of them almost as different languages. So something could be expressed more clearly in one format than another. And I feel like as I've progressed, they've kind of all joined together and created almost a new language, which allows for more nuance, I guess. And so, yeah, I think you're right in that they are kind of merging in this way, which I'm happy about. So it makes me less schizophrenic.
And utilizes like, both your, like sort of all parts of your degree, right? And I think is the way that more artists are working, right? Is that you choose the best media for the idea rather than like forcing something to fit into one language or one process.
Exactly.
And it feels like you've just found this really great way of merging both of those. I also noticed, I think about your works so much, that those early works where you use your own likeness and then you sort of move into using other individuals, but they're dressed the same. So they are sort of that tribe or unit. But more recently, maybe as the landscape has taken more precedence, the figures are often obscured. I mean, they're similar in that the faces are obscured, maybe like the red hoods, but something more deliberate about obscuring the figures.
Yeah, I think for someone who's so interested in the figure, I've never been really interested in the idea of a portrait as identity based on your facial features. I never want it to be that specific. It's more, I like the idea of portraiture where it's more about the situation that you're in or the action that you're in and how someone holds themselves in that. So I never wanted to, somehow to me, it feels less universal if it's a portrait of somebody who's recognizable, or that they become less of a catalyst for the viewer. So by obscuring them in a way or making them somewhat more generic, it then allows a person to look at it and envision themselves in that space, I think.
Mm-hmm. And in thinking about monuments, both like the public art work that you've done and some other sculptural or photographic pieces that feel like they are monuments, those too have been much more abstracted, which I think we're all learning is the way we need to move towards monuments, right? Like less about individuals and more of these abstracted ideas. But I don't know in this moment if you've thought different, if you think differently about monuments and sort of memorial, or the way that some of those projects that were more related to that concept or idea.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we could have a whole conversation just about monuments and memorials and stuff, but you know, ways of recontextualizing them, learning from them, deconstructing them, and making new ones. But I think moving forward, like I always gravitate towards works that, in terms of monuments and memorials, that go beyond just the idea of like a statue, that kind of end up being something larger and incorporate the viewer, so it becomes more of a physical experience. So for instance, like the memorial that I did, the stones range in size, and so you're encouraged to like sit on them or and look out into the river at where the piers were, which was like a predominantly you know, gay and lesbian hangout, or it faces the Statue of Liberty. So the memorial, in general, memorials can become part of a larger conversation with the environment that they're in and the community that they're part of, instead of just being a statue plunked down in a plaza. You know, that I feel like that has served its purpose, and we need to find new ways of commemorating events and people.
For sure. I'm trying to think if I have other specific questions that I might ask you. I guess when you were talking about the sort of apocalyptic nature of the works, they felt so apocalyptic, and now they just feel like New York Times photos.
Yeah, I know, it's kind of sad.
Yes, it is. I mean, that was one of the reasons of pulling this work into the exhibition, right? We were thinking about this current moment. And while it does feel apocalyptic, the deconstruction photograph, it does feel more empowering in a way. I mean, these folks are choosing, they're hanging in this sort of precarious situation, but they are relaxed. It feels like a way of reclaiming sort of this moment, or adaptation, or...
That's what I was going to say, that we're very adaptable. I mean, I think even looking at, you know, this pandemic, I was saying to my husband that it was really interesting back in March and April and May, if you went into the city, like I remember I had to bike into the city, and it was scary because it was empty. I mean, there was no one on the street. And to be in New York City, like completely empty, there was something really wrong about it that just felt apocalyptic. And then we went like a month ago, we biked in, and everybody's back out on the street. Everybody's wearing masks, but they're walking, they're biking, there's like outdoor restaurants, there's like a sense of liveliness that, you know, people have just adapted to this and figured out a way to work around it. And so I think that that's the thing about the human spirit, is that even in an apocalyptic situation, there's a sense of adaptability. And I think I learned that just even from, you know, stories of my family, and this idea of having left Cuba, you know, with a suitcase on a plane ride, and this notion that like you might have to leave everything behind on a day's notice, but you'll get through it, you'll adapt, you know.
Yeah, I feel like as grim as the image appears in some way, it does feel a little more hopeful and optimistic. That I think maybe initially I connected it to the idea of immigrants or refugees adapting, but it feels more more relatable for all of us, I think, in this moment.
Yeah. Well, and I hope that also like the element of beauty kind of offsets the grimness or the horror of things sometimes. So
Agreed. Yeah, I think like the beautiful clouds, and there's just something about the image that really draws you in, so that you can look at this kind of difficult, difficult works. But also, although I know that it is photoshopped, your skill is so good that it is hard to not sort of believe.
yeah.
I think in works where there are multiples of you, it becomes obvious that it is
Right.
photoshopped, but your skill is so high that it's hard even then not to question,
Yeah.
to just be like, yeah, of course those people are hanging in those
Yeah.
hammocks from that dilapidated building.
Yeah, I've always tried to straddle that line of like verisimilitude where it feels like something that could potentially be there or happen, but also is just slightly so off that you're like, no, not so, that you're not thrown into a complete world of fiction. Like I like that it's a window into what could be. Like all the ingredients of the laws of gravity and physics and everything are still, they still apply, you know.
Right. Yeah. Suspension of disbelief. Okay, so I think maybe we'll turn it over to Shoshanna now, and then we could kind of reconvene. So you should be able to
share my screen now. All right, here we go. Oh, wait a minute. Let me get my, where did you go? There you are. Can you guys see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you so much, Leah, for organizing this. I'm going to just get started. So I just did a lecture yesterday to an undergraduate class at WINCA. So it's a very truncated version with some older works and a little travelogue to start. So as Leah said, I was born in Kingston, Jamaica. I won't tell you the date or you'll figure out my age. And those lovely people made me, Mark and Marlene. My mom is a late mother. She's up in the spirit world and I'm in her belly there. They were both artists. My mom came to America and fell in love with New York City. And but they were conscientious objectors and they left and went back to Jamaica and to raise a family. They went to SVA and after they graduated, they became art directors in Jamaica. So a few years into the mid-70s, my family moved to Montclair, New Jersey. So I say from paradise to the armpit. No, New Jersey's great. And this is a very tall 10. I'm 10 years old in this picture. And we, sort of had to like assimilate into this American life. Both my parents were sort of hippies and my mom, of course, coming from the West Indies and raising her children, my younger sister in the picture, in America. She was very sort of nervous about this kind of the structure, this system, this country. She loved New York City, but and so she kind of really informed me about who I was. They both did, and how to navigate in the world. One of which, when I go back to Jamaica, I'm not Jamaican enough, and when I'm in America, I'm exoticized. And my mom never converted to Judaism, so I'm not Jewish, but my name is Shoshanna Weinberger. So there's this constant periphery that I sit on and can kind of go in and out of spaces with this sort of knowledge. I'm informed by religion, but, a kind of spiritual. So this kind of lends itself to the work and my investigation of double consciousness, invisible Blackness, and cultural ambiguity. But, growing up, a lot of ideals of beauty were informed by art history. And it was, very, very heroic, very beautiful images. And trying to kind of like, sort of equate oneself with that or survey oneself. And then also there's like this 1% of the population that I had to look at, gracing magazines. And none of these sort of new Venuses looked like me. So I had to kind of like play and struggle with that idea. And then for the women and the people in my family, the brown and black-skinned folks, people that raised me, looking at marginalized bodies in the context of a new Hottentot, it really was complicated. It really kind of like affected me. And it led me to sort of create a series, which I've been working on probably for the past 15 years in different iterations. And I started to use my own body in right after I got out of the Art Institute of Chicago. And this is from a film still called 100 Thongs. And I was really like sort of enamored and really taken back by Jean Dunning's film of putting on pantyhose. And I think she put like 100 pantyhose on. And it was like, by the time she was finished, it was like grotesque. And I sort of, was very inspired by that and decided to kind of play around with the idea of putting on 100 thongs. And so this is a film still. And I decided at that point to use myself as the model and as the muse. And started to create through materiality, gouache and ink, all water-based materials, a series of archetypes and a series of pictures that reflected my body, marginalized bodies, but then also that kind of duality, the duality of not being enough of one thing or the other, sort of fitting in between the worlds of an Afro and a perm. And that kind of juxtaposition and play was something that I wanted to work with the work. And also, similar to Anthony, removing any sort of indication of a face, of any kind of identity, just going down to the basics. And the first criteria of beauty is hair, lips, breasts, buttocks, and all the accessories that come with beauty. And I was always really interested in cabinets of curiosity and collections. I would pore over them as a young child, and I was always interested in collecting shells and butterflies and sort of seeing how in the same genus there's slight nuances and differences. And so with the early work, this is a pretty early work from 2012, I started to catalog and curate the drawings I was making into these collections, almost like they were my curiosities. So 3 Trimesters of a Corn Roll is about this experience of beauty through hair. And then sort of coming upon the word strange fruit and the song Strange Fruit. And a lot of my work is about literature, about history. And so the Strange Fruit series started. And it was about this idea of taking this song, which Billie Holiday sung, but she didn't write it. A lot of people think it's her song, but actually Abe Maripold, a Jewish school teacher in the Bronx, wrote this poem based on seeing a lynching. And it's such a horrifying image, but the song also alludes to this horrifying moment. And I kind of, after I was reading about it and thinking about it, I thought about the idea that my father is a Jewish man who wrote this poem that he seeded inside of this Afro-Caribbean woman, and my mother birthed me as a song. So I kind of wanted to take on Strange Fruit and reclaim it into something that is reflective of me, not this violent act, and sort of play with this whole series. So the figures are these strange fruits. And in some cases, total identity is removed and multiples are put into place. All the body parts of male gaze are sort of enlisted and employed. The chains are there to sort of assist with the idea of commodity, bodies as commodity. And being sold and being sort of kept. And doing a lot of my own self-portraits to create a sense of humor and tension in the work, but then also just to kind of play with materiality. So this is a collage, pink high heels, and thinking about myself, sort of being a young woman, but sort of early puberty, and kind of like dealing with being kind of being this otherness in school and trying to fit in. And then in terms of like really kind of harnessing all the archetypes of female, I sort of created this collection of Strange Fruit. And this was sort of the first major collection, sort of presenting all my muses that I actually used throughout the years and in different iterations. And this is just an image of it at the National Gallery in Jamaica for the 2012 biennial. And just to give you an idea of context, the different colors and sort of the idea of like curating these takes the longest for me, and having these muses sort of present themselves. And then also thinking about women sort of expanding to be everything for everybody. That idea that the context of the cultural history of like female expose and presentation, we're always on presentation, you know, we're always about this myth and mutation, and we also have to be confined within the walls of society. And in this case, the Potbelly porn star, The Rise of Bacon, is about this sort of Jerry Springer world of like, you know, excess and mundanity. And I really wanted to kind of convey that. And this piece is 5 foot by 7 foot. So they're really large pieces. And I have actually, just for a relationship, some installation images, just to show you the scale of the works. They're gouache on paper. And there's one in the distance in this picture from Smack Gallery in South Africa. She wears it well, but she's not in this, she's not in this 10-minute presentation. So also kind of thinking about bodies as other things, as morphic shapes, as fruit, as maybe the said lynching. Menage a Trois is about this idea of bodies being sort of bought and sold, amalgamation of mass, and sort of all just hanging on one thread. And it seems like this piece, which was made in 2013, is very relevant today with how the ideology of brown and black bodies vis-a-vis the, you know, the sort of corruption and injustice sort of still lives on, unfortunately, and how we're going to combat that. So this is about that idea of control and containment. And then the piece that's part of the Van Avery Smith art collection, which is busted at the seams, 36 double D, a little too personal, but but using myself as this muse, right? I mean, these are all about me in the end, and the idea that, you know, the tufts of hair is sort of like pushing out of these controlled coils or braids, and thinking about that idea of white aesthetic as being the aesthetic that's American, which is kind of an interesting concept. The idea that white aesthetic is the right aesthetic. So like for many years, getting my hair permed straight or a relaxed curl so that it wasn't kinky and it wasn't too kinky, and that kind of control within the box of aesthetics. Very interesting to me, which I don't do now, but that idea. And also using myself again, doing different material, kind of stepping away from the illustrative into more sort of abstract, playing with India ink, which is sort of my main thing other than gouache, and sort of playing around with the idea of just letting the materials live and be part of the body, be part of the space. And also in many cases, a lot of my works are framed sort of as specimens. So I consider myself a visual anthropologist, sort of taking these memories and experiences and then sort of mapping them out. And also thinking about the type of the archetypes that are out there that I, encounter, or that I am using as a muse. So in this case, a sort of a stripper, backlit smoker, one topless enterprise under perpetual midnight is about that dark, perpetual black stripper club. And you go into, it's all dark, and it's sort of bedroom lit, and that kind of conflict between women, sort of women and the employment, women in the workforce, what women have to do, if they in some cases need to do, to survive, and how our bodies are used, and how we manipulate them, but then also how women sort of survey each other as men. And that's a kind of an interesting phenomenon to me. And then also taking the same muse. So I take a lot of my muses and I put them in different scenarios. And so she's back again, but she's sort of, all out in the sun, maybe. And the crooked teeth is another sort of visual iconography that I use, or signifier. The crooked teeth shows up a lot in my work, and it's about the fragility of beauty. So she's got these crooked teeth, so the idea of that. And then thinking about sort of, the modernist grid and modernism, and thinking about the idea of comparative studies. So kind of going back to that idea of a collection of shells, that sort of cabinet of curiosities, but then thinking about it more contemporarily, and sort of a comment to Andy Warhol's soup cans. I sort of reappropriate my own imagery into this idea of these different soup cans with my Honey Boo. This is Honey Boo, one of my muses. She comes up a lot, Honey Boo Boo sometimes. And this idea that this sort of expanded, bloated, overfed pinup has been exploited. But then she's also so passive with her love lost, love found graffiti that I sort of handwrite on her butt. And her lips are these Maybelline lips that sort of are like the different soup can recipes on her face. And she's got that kind of bedroom sort of come hither pinup on the beach. And then pushing that further and doing hand-painted images, working with the idea of obsessive mark making. These are all individually hand-painted, not projected and painted. And then wanting to kind of play with that idea of the human genos and how we're sort of mutations of our family, and we kind of continue to mutate as we procreate. And in some cases, some of the strange fruit figures have 3 legs, and some have 2 breasts, and some don't have coils in their hair. And then there's one that's inverted, and taking the crest out of many one from the Jamaican motto and using that in this piece sort of as a quilt or a flag. And kind of thinking about that idea of out of many one, and that's myself. And so there's this inverted sort of a sepia image that sort of is flipped, and thinking about that idea of comparative studies. Similar to photographers Bernard and Hilla Becker, who I really loved, and actually a lot of my inspiration comes from photography, as I worked after undergrad for a photography collection in Chicago for 6 years. So I kind of sort of started to see how photography was sort of surveying humanity, and I kind of wanted to sort of play with that in my own work. And then this is just a picture of how it looks installed. And then the Invisible Visibility series, also about invisible blackness, one drop, passing, that idea that, these sort of microaggressions that I'll get, like, oh, where are you from? Or oh, you're from Jamaica? You don't look Jamaican. And so that kind of idea of like, what does that mean? The idea of like, what does someone's identity supposed to look like? And how is that's ingrained? And that comes from like all manner of people, which I find, kind of fascinating. And then being in spaces where I'm like, oh, it's this kind of party, and so finding myself in these sort of, yeah, linear spaces, peripheral. And these are all based on like hairdos that I've had in my past. And they kind of remind you of the sort of awkwardness of like high school and these yearbook photos that are sort of anonymous. And then you just use one brush. And some of these have collage elements in them, but I'm trying to like kind of limit the palette to kind of keep it more of a sort of a photographic imagery. And then this is a show that I had, a solo show at Project for Empty Space in their old space here in Newark. And this was right after the election. So the work got decidedly more aggressive, where the portraits became more about sort of anger and sort of the institution of bigotry, and I kind of wanted to play with that. So I sort of started to wash out, and the lips kind of bleeding into the figure. And then also using the element of 3D, or sculpture. This piece was sort of 2 years in the making. It started at Joan Mitchell Center when I did my residency there as a wood laser cut figure. And Strange Fruit was, people were always saying, you should do it's very three-dimensional on paper. You should do something with it. And for years, I wasn't sure what I would do with it. And so I kind of came across the idea of making these fractal figures that are laser cut on double-sided mirror to sort of work with the idea of marrying strange fruit and invisible visibility. So the idea is when you look at these, they start to blend, and their forms kind of become invisible. And that idea of transparency and confusion is something that I wanted to play. And so these are sort of like mangroves or a herd of animals or something. And there's about 100 of them. And I'm working with double-sided mirror on some future projects, not this image, but in the same vein. And then after my show, I lost my studio and I had to like go through all my things. And there's all this talk about immigration and who's to be let in and who's American and what it is to all this sort of this xenophobic zeitgeist was going on, and just like really sort of uncomfortable. And so I didn't realize this, but I was going through all my work that I didn't like. These were all the drawings that I was like, oh, this is awful. And I just paint over them and I set them aside. And I kind of revisited them 2 years ago, last year mainly. These were up in a solo show at Trestle Gallery in Brooklyn last year. And the blackout drawings are about this idea of me, the artist, sort of deliberately covering up the images so you can't see the identity of the work at all, and just letting the paper curl, letting the papers rip from the ink, and just putting them up in sort of this like English salon style, which I thought was sort of kind of a nod to colonialism, and then kind of going back to the idea of how to investigate skin and how to sort of not use the white paper as the skin itself, but kind of thinking about Jamaica, thinking about coming from the Caribbean, and that sense of longing and disconnect with the work. So this is a large piece. It's about 5 foot by maybe 8 feet. And these ideas about sunsets and longing and these selfies. So it's a real comment on the whole selfie culture and social media. And so I took a whole bunch of drawings and painted them all the same. And then I painted them all black to kind of black out those images, and then leaving one as sort of the keyhole or the viewfinder that looks out into the vista. So thinking about that idea of reinvention and alienation. And then going back into some new works and going back into work and like actually just proactively like covering up what I wanted, you know, this sort of the editing and the censorship of bodies, and sort of what we are allowed to see and what I'm allowing the viewer to see, and introducing the stripes in the work, which is, I'll tell you more about that in a few more slides.
Shoshanna, I want to make sure we have time for questions.
Oh my gosh. No. All right. So here you go, digital breakdown, Housing Baker. It's all about Josephine Baker and Adolphe Luce building a house out of stripes for her. It was really, and all about like containing brown and black bodies. And this is just some new work that I'm doing. Oh my God. Investigating during the pandemic, going through all my stuff. And then this is the work, I'm almost done. This is my solo show in Harlem that just opened up last week. And I have this one piece that's in it. It's got 13 stripes and it's got hair that's up. That's sort of about, being on the periphery, looking at our country. And I have a 3D, if we could do this really quick and I can just show you and then we'll be done. So sorry. And so this is also what's happening in the world of the pandemic. So it's really nice that Long Gallery gave this virtual experience. And so this is the work that's up right now. And of course, stripes are about, borders, barcodes, trickery, intersectionality, hybridity. So this is what's going on and I can stop now. Sorry. Well, actually, that was it.
Interesting. It was hard to make you stop because it was all really interesting.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I timed it, but I guess it went over.
So I guess one of the things that strikes me from listening to you talk is you said this really beautiful thing about your parents like birthing a song. The works are hard. I mean, there's this balance between these works that are kind of funny and shiny and hot pink and like silly, but then they're also challenging. They're about like the psychological trappings of beauty and fashion and those of us that are not that 1% of women, and there's like real trauma associated with surveying ourselves against that. And so I'm curious about like when you're thinking about making work, if you could just say, sort of think about that, because the works, like on one hand, the gold is like a necklace or fashion accessory, but then it also references slavery and more challenging things from our past, but then they're also kind of funny in a way, some of the images.
Yeah, there's definitely like this self-deprecating humor in the work, because that's kind of like how I've navigated, in the world with two grandmothers that are 97 years old in my life. I can only navigate through humor. So this is like how, I want the works to be about like animal and human, about grotesque and funny. The titles are self-referential to my history growing up here, being Gen X, and the idea that that I want these to be identifiable to a lot of the viewers. And so a lot of people do feel like they'll come up to me and say, I'm Haitian American, and my grandparents think I'm too American, and so so that's something that like is easily identifiable with the work, and the type of girl, the type of woman, the type of lady. Those are the things that influenced me with the pieces.
And obviously pulling from sort of Western ideals in our history, that's true for Anthony too. Like the images sort of contradict the Western bias in portraiture and art history. And you said self-deprecating, and Anthony, you've said something around that too, like self-love, self-hate images, at least some of the older works. So
yeah. Yeah, the early self-portrait work definitely explored the idea of self-deprecation, narcissism, self-love, self-hate, all of that, those issues. So.
And it does feel like an animalistic kind of thing for both of you too. Like I don't know. I think about some of those early images with actual animals or with like the adolescence that feels really animalistic.
Yeah, I sort of think more like Lord of the Flies kind of, it's a survivalist animalism, I guess.
Yeah, that's that adaptation again, right?
Yeah.
And I had so many questions and I feel like I'm worried about timing. So let's see. I was trying to think about some of the other. You both sort of alluded to pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like how, Anthony, you have made some work related to the pandemic and to the current protests, but thinking more even just like how has the pandemic affected your studio practice? How has it affected your career? Have there been lost opportunities? Like how do we move forward from this?
Well, I mean, in terms of like, for me, I live 5 minutes away from my studio. And I feel like as an artist, I'm used to isolation and I'm used to like kind of hunkering down in my studio and sort of focusing. So for me, it's been about like reinvestigating my work, my past work, and having that time to do it without interruption. It's been actually very busy studio for me as of lately with some shows and experiences and going back to work virtually. And the idea that that artists are more important than ever, and that the fact that a lot of really great work has been, in history has been made during sort of warlike times, thinking art historically. So that idea that being part of that history during this time has been pretty good, a real positive way. Anyway, so.
Yeah.
I remember reading something at the beginning of the shutdown about different careers that were hazardous or the safest careers, and apparently artists had like one of the safest careers because they're traditionally locked up in their studio by themselves. So I mean, I'm used to isolating, but yeah, for me, I know it's been a really hard time for so many people and it's been really tragic, but for me, it's been kind of amazing. I feel bad saying that, but it's nice not having any deadlines, not caring if anybody sees anything or not. Like I've been experimenting, doing things that maybe I wouldn't have done otherwise. And also it sort of puts a check on your sense of mortality in a way that's like, oh, well, is this really going to be the work that I want to, if I get sick and die next week, is this what I want to leave behind? Like, you need to make the stuff you've been wanting to make, So, and my studio is like literally across the street from my house. So it hasn't curtailed my ability to actually get in and work. If anything, the fact that my husband has, been working from home has freed up more time for me. So it's, I hesitate to say that it's been great, but I've secretly liked it. And I feel ashamed of that.
Yeah, I agree with Anthony. I mean, I'm on the same, I feel bad. I mean, I was talking to another artist and being like, I'm doing great. Like the world is like collapsing and I'm like, I've never felt more clear or like what my work wants to focus on, and how I want the world to see how I see the world. I think is like, this is the time for that. I mean, I had one show, my solo show at Wave Hill was postponed till next year. And even that, like I'm getting like revisiting that work that was going to be like on display in June. I'm like really like looking at it again. And like, so I'm having this really like cherishing this extra time to kind of like look at it all.
I had stuff that was canceled, but there's something I don't know. I sort of liken it to like when New York has a really bad heat wave and you just see everybody walking around and everybody's so miserable that they're sort of in it together and there's this sense of community. And I was like, at first everything, was getting canceled and I was like, oh no, like, I live off of my work in a way. So I was like, how am I going to get by? But then I sort of realized, well, everybody's in this boat. So we'll just all figure it out together. Like in a way it was comforting. But that's a strange way of thinking about it because at the same time, it is really tragic. I mean, so I guess it has its pluses and minuses.
Yeah, I feel like so many artists have sort of said that like, oh, my daily practice hasn't changed very much. I'm used to being alone. And for both of you that are sort of responding to things in the moment, thinking about social or political issues, it's good inspiration. It's just we're looking to you to help us out too, to help us get out of this. I think there's a question, right, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I guess, sorry, I had to unmute myself. Yes, we've got a question from Carter, who's got a question for both of you. To Anthony specifically, he asks, can you speak to the relationship between process of collection versus process of creation? To what extent does one inform the other, or do they follow independent trajectories? And for Shoshanna, do you consider your muses as an act of collection as well?
So I guess I'll try to answer it in two ways because I'm not sure in what sense he's using the word collection, but
he's referencing your comment about having sat with the photos of the tents for some time.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I tend to photograph things that stick out to me, and I know I'm going to use them at some point of time. So I do have a collection in a sense of like a photo library of things that I've come across that I'm like, oh, one day I can use that. So that definitely is a source of inspiration, but I kind of pull from a lot of different places. And so it ends up being something where things end up lining up in this kind of visceral way where I'll see something else and I'm like, oh, that reminds me of this other thing that I have, and I end up putting them together. Or it has to do with like the ability of time and when I can work on something. And so, for instance, that image with the tents, I had photographed them a year ago, and there are all these like huge construction bags in there too. Those I had photographed 2 years ago. I didn't really have time to work on any of it until quarantine, and all of those things kind of came together at the same time and like sort of birthed this image that maybe would not have been the same image if I had done it at the time that I shot it. And so I think the collection informs the way that something is made, but also like the timing of it. And like I said earlier, a lot of how I make work is a visceral response to what's going on around me. So that, I guess that dovetails into the issue of time too.
And to answer the question, does my muses act as a collection? So I'm thinking like a cabinet of curiosities or like a shell collection. Yes, definitely. I kind of sort of look at myself and then also look at it against a type of person or woman, and then sort of try and create that type and keep them and catalog them and maybe reuse them again, or then they end up becoming me in sort of my depiction of them or portrait of them. So I hope that answers your question. They are serial, they do come up, and sometimes they just sort of happen. Sometimes I'll use parts of them, like in the new series, I'll just use the coiled hair and no other body part, maybe just, shapes and lines. But yeah, they're definitely, I'm definitely cataloging and collecting as a visual anthropologist. So, yeah.
Got another question for both of you. Russ asks, what responsibilities do you have as an artist to your audience, especially in times of exaggerated social upheaval?
Donna, you want to?
Well, I would say, I mean, it's, you know, I'm here to express my anger, my history and experiences to the mass. So I would say that my story is unique, but I believe that there are commonalities throughout, and finding a way to shed light on issues in my own unique mark making is something that's really important to me. And it will then also be part of a larger continuum of artists, and fall into a larger history of artists sort of commenting on world events. So yeah.
I don't know what my responsibility is to my audience. I mean, I feel like I do what I do because when I don't do it, I am not a great person to be around. So it's something that I am fortunate that I'm able to do, and I'm fortunate that there is an audience. But I honestly try not to think about other people so much when I'm working, because that can bog me down. Like, I just try to focus on what it is I want to say. It's more that I'll have the hazy sort of idea of an idea, and I want to see it come to fruition. Like, I need to see it on the outside, and it never looks the way that the initial idea looks in my head. But somehow I need to like get it out and see it. And so that's more the impetus. And I'd be lying if I said that I didn't care about having an audience or what my audience thinks. And so I'm happy that there are people who are willing to look at what I do and they respond to it, but it's something that I almost actively try not to think about. And so I, in that sense, I have no idea what my responsibility is because I try to ignore it. So.
I mean, it's interesting to hear you all say that, because I feel like I often am asking artists like what their work does, or what what does this do? How does art work? How do your pieces, what do they do in the world? Do they do anything? Can art make these changes that we want to see in the world? But what I'm hearing from both of you is that you're interested in documenting and highlighting and bringing some awareness to some of these challenging issues of today around race and displacement, migration, marginalized bodies, but that maybe the making of it, like what the art does, at least for Anthony, feels a little bit cathartic. And for Shoshanna, maybe the same, that when I think about body images and like sort of trauma around that, I don't know, is there a cathartic nature to making the work?
I think it's like informing. It informs me of my history, and then like there's a connectivity. I think that's gratifying when people look at it, and or when they comment on it, or they're like, oh, I know that girl, I know that, like, or I'm that person, and I find that that's like, you know, it's the sort of the only language that I'm really good at. Like, visual language is like the only thing that, like, the only way I can express, you know, how I feel about things in the world. Like Anthony, I don't really like think about my audience, but I've been informed enough by my audience, like, oh, I really like that. Oh, I can identify with that. Oh, that looks like Don't Tread on Me, like that most recent work. And I was like, oh, whoa, okay. Like, my family lineage didn't go that far back in America. And, you know, so it's like that kind of response, unexpected responses and connections to things that are either like the subconscious, that I think is really exciting, that I'm consciously doing or subconsciously, you know, it's like it's all melded in. So yeah.
Well, yeah, the idea of sort of being part of this history, this moment. I mean, we have obviously reframed the works in this show to be responsive to this moment. Like we respond using our own experiences in the time, right? And but I love the idea of like thinking about what this work will mean in a few decades too, that it will sort of encapsulate this particular moment.
Well, you know, just a student, sorry, yesterday asked me about what kind of collections do you want to be in? And I had mentioned the Davidson College collection. And in fact, I'm so proud to be in, my work is in a show that is about the pandemic and protest, because it shows that the work can go to a larger audience and be about more than just me making it out of like a body that's trying to fit into everything, but it's also about a broader issue and a larger audience. So that I had mentioned that yesterday. So it's interesting that you mentioned that. So yeah.
So I know we've gone a little over time, so I just thought we could wrap up by maybe just if there's anything else that you want to share about what's coming up. And I realized that I never even asked you how you all are. Like, how are you dealing in this moment? Are you well? So maybe you could close with something optimistic if you're doing, it sounds like you're both doing fine.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, like for me, it's been relatively the same, if not somewhat better. So, but yeah.
Project, anything coming up next?
I mean, I don't know if it's still happening. We'll see. But I'm supposed to have a show in Amsterdam in May, and I was also tentatively slotted to have one in Barcelona, but in the spring. But I have like schedules have totally changed, and art fairs and all that kind of stuff. So at the moment, I'm just kind of working and pretending that things are going to be okay.
Eventually.
Yeah.
And I have a two-person show in Brussels right now. It's by appointment there. Someone said, "Oh, is it virtual?" I said, "No, I actually shipped work out. They took the work from me." So that's kind of been nice. And I also have the solo show in Harlem. I have sort of a window piece in my studio, which was the last slide, for Art Off Screen, which was curated by Eileen Young Lynch, about like getting artists to put work in public spaces. So that's going to be up till October 10th. And then of course, Wave Hill next year in May, which was postponed due to the pandemic. So that'll be in the Bronx. And some other things, but as we say in Jamaica, I'm not going to goat mouth it. So you don't want to say it and then like it doesn't happen and everyone's like, what happened with it? So I'm going to wait till there's something like concrete, but anyway, but really busy. Like I'm in the studio every day,
It's great.
working. So it's, yeah.
Well, it's good.
Very fortunate.
Good to check in with both of you and that you're doing well. And we will stay tuned for those projects. I think hopefully we can all bounce back and we can be in galleries socially distanced, right? We just might not be able to have big events. So, but it's okay. It feels so good to be able to see art in person.
Yeah.
I went to galleries the other day. It was really nice. And I think the gallerists are very excited to see people too. Someone took a picture of someone came in. I was like, wow, that's, usually you have to like fight to see anything, especially in New York. So in some ways it's good, especially like the museums are now at like 30% capacity. So if you book a ticket, you virtually have the whole space to yourself. So
yeah, take advantage of it while we can, right? Yeah. Well, thank you all. Yeah. Thanks so much. And this exhibition will be up until October 18th, and then the works live in our collection, lucky for us. So we hope that we'll be able to utilize them also in teaching and in other shows in the future. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.